I, I think information is really great to receive. Our system thrives off information. At least when the system is relating to information in a healthy way, then information is very positive. It can be that our thinking relates to information in a possessive way, in a trying to attain more and gain more and use the information and whatever comes out of the processing of the information as something that it then has to show the world. But when it comes to, in my experience, information that is specifically relevant to the change of the human being towards what these talks are about, which is peace of mind and daily living. So the talks are always about happiness for the human being, but that happiness is to be found in a very special form, a very particular form, and that is continuous, unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance. And the reason that we don't find ourselves with that happiness is because our system that has grown from something very small. The sperm and the egg come together and an entity is formed, and then it grows automatically, not our doing. It follows a divine blueprint, we could say, a very amazing set of instructions that are contained within the organism, and the organism grows on its own into something very complex, very intricate. That in itself, when we look at it, is mystical. And as part of that growing process, the organism is exposed to life and to what we can call new conditioning, moment after moment after moment. And so the organism, which is a biological entity, doesn't develop in isolation. It doesn't develop in a vacuum. It develops in a very complex environment that becomes part of its development, becomes intrinsically part of what we are on a biological and psychological level. And so the reason that we don't have this continuous peace of mind is because the organism has developed a particular way, a way that forces suffering to be an intrinsic part of our experience of life. We can give some rough explanations why or what has caused the development of the organism, such that suffering is a significant part of our experience in life. One of them, we could say, is just the way that the experience of life presents. So the way that our senses work, the way that the world is, the image of the world, the experience of the world is constructed after all of the stimuli are received from the external world, and how the sense of self exists within that overall experience that is constructed. So this experience I'm talking about is what we know as daily living. This very moment is the complex experience I'm suggesting is constructed because of all of the inputs that come in. And then we know the experience as it arises in this moment. And included in the experience is the sense of who we are relative to everything else. And we don't create how the experience arises moment after moment. For the baby in the first days and weeks, the experience, I suspect, is quite different in structure, especially the sense of self. What within that singular experience, which each moment is a singular experience made up of seemingly very many different components. And for the baby, the experience is quite different. One, because their intellect isn't developed. So thoughts, as we know them, which are part of the momentary experience, aren't there. The sense of self of the baby, I suspect, also is quite different, because the repeated feedback loop of life hasn't yet sent the information to the system that, oh, I am this body. So often when you see a baby, if it grabs its own finger, there isn't any differentiation from it grabbing someone else's finger. It hasn't really received that touch feedback often enough to have defined itself as being something to do with the physical entity. So as more and more experience is received day after day, a sense of self and how that sense of self relates to the external objects becomes the developing experience. And that's really a very impersonal growing process that the baby wasn't in control of. The baby grows and receives the experience as it is, and then that feedback loop of the experience changes things as it changes things. So my suggestion is that human beings have gone through a growth process, a sort of default growth process that is pretty standard for most human beings, that leaves in place a sense of self that feels uncomfortable in life. And it feels uncomfortable with life because it also, as part of the development process in the later years, starts to feel like the best that is available in life is pleasure as opposed to pain, and seeks pleasure and feels some sort of satisfaction when pleasure is delivered because of its own actions, or just because of good luck, or because of kindness of the other, and feels a sense of attack or lack when pain is delivered, or pleasures, outcomes that are pursued don't eventuate. And then these internal thoughts and feelings and emotions that arise are identified with as being a significant part of who I am. So all of this is not something that anyone really is in control of. No one does this. It is just the inevitable process of how we develop. And quite clearly, some humans develop a stronger set of these structures because circumstance is different for everyone. Circumstance is extreme for some people and less extreme for others, extremely painful or extremely filled with, let's say, love is a pleasure that some people are fortunate to have in their lives. And so all of these differences create differences in the way the structure is developed. However, the structure still tends to develop more or less in a way that there is an identification with oneself as the body, thoughts, feelings, emotions, and an outward looking for completion or for satisfaction, for contentment, which inevitably isn't there because of this structure that I'm saying has formed, which is an uncomfortableness with oneself in life. And a program, a formula that has been set in place that says this uncomfortableness can be fixed, can be sorted out by me finding something out there in the future. And essentially, it's a structure that has formed because of all of these inputs, and some of the inputs are specific sets of information that society have given us, parents, the society we live in, our friends, teachers, religious teachers. And so when we receive information that is specifically designed to deal with this error, you could say, it's an error relative to a more optimal development process. Now, it's not a fundamental error because life is what it is. And so this growing process that I'm talking about is part of life. And it may change in the future because life, when we observe it based on what seems to be in place, life on many levels is an evolution. It's changing. At some point, if we follow the evolution model, there weren't even humans to grow into this in this particular way, and then the change happened, and so there are humans that grow in this way, and maybe in the future there will be humans that don't grow this way, they grow differently. As it turns out, even the way things are now, there is the potential for that growth structure, or that structure that has been put in place, to change. And so there is specific information that can be delivered, that can be instrumental in the instrumental as part of the change of that structure. And spiritual teachings, in my assessment, are that information that is specifically designed to make a point, to bring about a specific change. So the information delivered is considered by whoever is delivering it. There's a reasoning and rationale behind it, and usually I would say that the reasoning and rationale has a lot to do with that person's own process, an understanding of their own process, a seeing of what things changed in order to bring about a change in their experience in life, which they often describe as being, or at least in this teaching, an experience of life that is an experience of peace of mind, freedom from suffering. Not freedom from unfortunate circumstance, not freedom from pain, but freedom from suffering, which is a psychological overlay on top of the pleasure and pain of life. And it turns out that it's that psychological overlay that we can call suffering that is what makes life so uncomfortable. It's what's there because of the structure that's been put in place, and it's what can fall away. Fall away, I would say, because the structure changes. Now, a teacher really should be speaking from their own experience. And if their experience has been observed through the process, then they'll tend to have an appreciation and an understanding of where people are coming from when they ask questions, when they describe their life experience. And then specific answers are given that are specifically relevant to that person or that problem. Now, if we look at teaching in general, there are many different approaches that can be taken. And if a teaching decides to take a particular approach, then specific things are said as part of that approach. They're not absolute truisms. They're not the truth. What they are is accurate information or important information, well thought out information, designed to deal with a particular problem in a particular way. Now, the process tends to be a process that changes over time. That's the nature of processes. There are sort of different phases, and the phases build on earlier phases. And there are often a lot of interconnected bits. And some teachings decide that it's worthwhile just focusing on one phase and saying things one way. And so if we hear that, we might mistake that as being the absolute truth, because it's delivered that way in order to effectively bring about change. Now, two of the most significant parts of the process and change that I feel I'd like to address is one, making it clear in simple everyday terms what the movement is about on a practical level. Right. The movement in practical terms can be described, and the problem and the changes can be described in practical terms. So many of you have heard me start off with the focus being peace of mind. Peace of mind in daily living, and peace of mind is the falling away of suffering, and suffering is a specific attitude to life. And that attitude really comes from how we, or where we find ourselves living life from. So peace of mind really comes and is linked to a shift that we can call a shift from involvement to witnessing. That, I would say, is one of the most fundamental shifts in the structure of the human being. The experience of life through what we call involvement is when there is no space, no capacity to observe thoughts, feelings, and emotions from outside. It means that the experience is structured. Our experience of life as it spontaneously arises in each moment is structured such that the sense of self is completely identified with thoughts, feelings, actions, pleasure and pain. So this identification translates into part of the experience, part of the momentary experience. Witnessing is not something that the human being, through their thinking, does, but rather it is a faculty or a capability or a potentiality of every human being that has atrophied and lays dormant. It hasn't died, but it's laid dormant. Because this identification with thoughts, feelings, actions, and pleasure and pain has become so strong. And therefore the experience we have is the experience of identification. And so if we're asked to explore our inner landscape, there's often sort of a limitation as to how clearly the inner landscape can be seen, can be explored, simply because you're trying to look at something that there is no space from. And so a shift where witnessing starts being how the experience is constructed. And so remember, I'm not saying we construct the experience. The experience is where we find ourselves. So in deep sleep, let's say when we're in deep sleep, there's no experience of daily life. And then we wake up in the morning and there is experience of the room and the world and the sense of self. There is the presence in the experience of the body and thoughts and feelings. You can pinch your leg and you'll feel pain. And so that is the whole experience. And then there will be all sorts of other more subtle feelings, including a sense of uncomfortableness, if that's what the structure and therefore the experience dictates will be felt. So it means that's what's contained in the experience. This movement where witnessing becomes how the experience is structured is really, really important for suffering to start weakening and eventually dissolve. So when we hear that you are not the body, you are not the thoughts, you are not the emotions, you are the witnessing presence, that your essence is not limited to form. That knowing yourself as form and as thoughts and emotions is actually part of ignorance. It's a part of not knowing yourself. It's described as Maya or illusion. And so to just hear these pointers, to hear that what you are at your core, or the essence of who you are, is witnessing presence, can be the beginning of a movement of this witnessing presence getting brighter and brighter until it becomes so one-pointed, so vibrant or alive, that witnessing presence can persist through all of the different states of the human being, the waking state, the dream state, and the sleep state. The witnessing presence is, importantly, we have to understand it. It isn't a witnessing that we do through the mind. It isn't seeing an object and then thinking that we're witnessing it because we are commenting on it in the mind. And the comment could be, oh, I'm witnessing the camera. that isn't the effortless true witnessing of our witnessing presence, but rather the observing of the intellect, or the observing of thought. So there is still, in that case, the observation of an outer world through the lens of our thinking. So if there's a yearning for us to know this aspect of ourself that we could say is more true than any other aspect of ourself, when we start to see that the aspect that we have identified with, such as thought or feeling, is very fleeting. It is rarely consistent for very long. We are thinking about one thing, and then we think about something else. We change our mind about the things that we're agreeing with or disagreeing with when new information comes in. So we can see that our beliefs, our opinions, our thoughts are very changing, and 1 minute we're thinking about politics, the next minute we're thinking about what we're going to do tomorrow. And so it can become very obvious that these thoughts and feelings and the body are really very inconsistent, always changing, coming and going. And one of the definitions of truth in a spiritual seeking teaching is that the truth is not changing. The truth doesn't come and go. This witnessing presence, when there is a recognition of it, is recognized as being a background to all of experience that has always been there. It is a presence that doesn't change in the same way that thoughts and emotions and the body change. This witnessing presence doesn't have the capacity to think or to create. Those are functions of the intellect and functions of the body. The witnessing presence just is aware from a distance. So all of these descriptions are new information delivered based on an understanding of the problem and the seeking process from my own perspective, which doesn't mean I understand it absolutely. Right? There will be, everyone has their own unique structure, but some people, when they go through the process, their destiny is to be particularly interested in a way that some other people aren't about what is happening. Maybe they have a capacity to look at what's happening with more critical thinking, and therefore discern which bits of the process are linked with what and what caused them, instead of making mistakes, which without making certain mistakes that are easily made, where two things happen simultaneously and then there's an assumption that one caused the other. And so if someone has those skill sets as part of their destiny, and through the seeking process there is this observation, and it's their destiny for the seeking process to deliver more and more peace of mind until eventually the suffering ceases, then that particular individual has useful information based on their own experience, and that information often is delivered because there is a recognition about how precious the change is, how simple it is on one respect. It doesn't make us extraordinary people in the way that is often imagined. There is something, you could say, extraordinary because the structure has changed. But what it's delivered is a really ordinary person. It hasn't delivered magical powers or it's not it's not God in human form. Those descriptions are given sometimes in some teachings to aid the process, because it is decided that, you know, if we describe ourselves this way in a particular teaching, that may have a positive effect on how people relate to the information, how they relate to the individual. And then some individuals are given very strong presences that create a marked difference between them and the average person. So those are sort of additional things in a way. I would say that, at least speaking about myself, I'm a very ordinary person. Life has delivered sufficient change through teachings. So what is delivered is based on one's own experience, but one's own experience understands that the change came because certain teachings were delivered, so those continue to be utilized and delivered after they have gone through this structure, so they're not going to be exactly the same. They don't need to be exactly the same. In fact, some radical changes happen through history as teachings get passed down and re-delivered through people that have gone through their own process. They make adjustments to the teachings because that's authentic for them based on their experience, based on what was important. It says, okay, what was important for me is this witnessing presence. And maybe one of the teachings that was also very important to them doesn't focus on that. So then a hybrid of two teachings can present. And we don't know whether that hybrid is actually going to be effective or not. That's not really the point. It's a matter of being yourself, doing what feels appropriate, and then the outcome is whatever it is. The process is very complex in a sense. The information then mixes with a very complex human being, and who knows how the information and the person receiving the information, how that's going to end up looking. So getting back to this witnessing presence, the pointers that describe what the witnessing is, describe it as the truth of who you are, suggest something like it isn't the observing of an object through thinking, which is the first movement based on the structure of the human. That's the first movement that happens when we hear about witnessing. Witness life as a happening. Witness thoughts arising, feelings arising. The first movement is to look from the perspective of the body-mind organism and look at life from the perspective of the body-mind organism. And maybe look at it without judging. And say, oh, I'm witnessing. what tends to happen if we're looking from the position of the body-mind organism, the mind, whether we intend it to be or not, or the thinking, is quite active in that process of observing. So all of these descriptions are really there as information. So I started off at the beginning saying information can be immensely useful once it's received, because our system is intelligent and it processes this. So it might say, okay, this witnessing is not something that I have put much energy into. It's not something I've heard about before, or it's not something I feel much interest in. It doesn't work when I've heard it before. I haven't found it translating into anything that seems to be of particular use. So that's why I'm suggesting it is an essential part of peace of mind setting in, because peace of mind is the capacity to see life from a detached witnessing perspective. And that detached doesn't mean insensitive or no feeling. It means a part of where life is witnessed from is uninvolved. Now, the other aspects of the human being, the body, the thinking, will have the feelings, the human feelings, and the combination, when the whole thing gets synthesized, when there is an integration, then there is a sense that I am a human being living life with feelings and emotions and thoughts and a body. And within that human being, or on the edge of the human being, there is a bright light of awareness that witnesses everything happening in the inner and outer world simultaneously. And so there is a paradox where one can't really describe one's experience as being the body or not the body, the thoughts or not the thoughts, but rather both. And when we look at it, that actually could be because of changes in the structure, whereby there are layers of the human being, and one of the layers is this witnessing, and it is still what you could say the human being. It's still what I am, part of what I am, a very significant aspect of the human being that was previously merged with other layers of the human being, such as the thoughts and the emotions and the feelings. And when that merging of different layers happens, then the experience feels a certain way. And the experience, when the merging happens, is what I was describing as an uncomfortableness in life. And so this separation of the layers is where there is this sense that I am a hybrid, in a sense, or that there is a difference from before, where on the one hand you can establish yourself, let's say, in one of the layers and say, actually I am not the body and I am not the feelings. And yet there can be a movement into some of the other layers where you say, oh, I am the body and the feeling. And so there can be this movement where you are predominantly centered in one of the several layers, or there can be the output or the resting where there is in a way, an integration of the different layers, all known to be one, which includes the witnessing layer, and yet they are all simultaneously what you are. Now, this witnessing presence, which really is a functioning, an aspect of the consciousness that functions through the human being, is something that develops as there is a practice, in a way, a movement of being the witness from time to time. Because at first the structure is still fairly much where the witnessing is not what's available. But with the information coming in, that structure might be being shaken a little bit. And then from time to time we find that a dropping into witnessing, not observing, but just this effortless witnessing of life that is happening, life in this moment, the cars weaving in between each other, the bikes weaving in between the cars, the people, including your feelings and emotions, happens. A witnessing from a place that is even able to see the body as an object. So the witnessing appears like it is happening from prior to the body or outside of the body. So when the structure is such that witnessing doesn't happen, and we hear about this witnessing, it can be frustrating. It's like, what are you talking about? How do I do witnessing? What am I? I don't know. I don't have a sense. I mean, I can see that. I can see the body. I can observe objects. Is that witnessing? Doesn't feel like it's particularly useful. And so can be frustrating. We can also think that the process is all about a state of witnessing when we hear what I'm speaking about. I'm suggesting that this space between what you are, the witnessing presence and objects, is an important part of the process. If we ignore it and say it's not about that, it's not about witnessing, then a movement that is part of the strengthening or the coming about of this witnessing might not ever be motivated. If I say it's all about witnessing, there may be an attachment to witnessing happening, and then we might find that the further integration after this witnessing becomes available doesn't happen. If we think it's all about witnessing, then the thinking mind might become so insistent on it happening that the natural witnessing I'm talking about, which is something that happens when there is a relaxation out of attachment to outcomes, isn't going to happen. Because the thinking mind is saying, how am I going to do witnessing? I have to do it. So I'm trying to suggest that it is important, so information coming in, but then within the descriptions also say it's not going to happen certain ways. It's not going to happen if the thinking mind is observing things and labeling the seeing. It's not going to happen if the thinking mind is insistent on it doing it. It's about an interest in allowing everything to be as it is. It's about an interest in seeing life as a non-dual arising, as a whole, which means starting to see all of the apparent differences as modulations of the one experience. It's about not being involved in changing the experience. A softness is needed. Witnessing is the natural movement of consciousness that functions through everyone. In every moment, life is being awared. There is the experience in every moment. And experience means awareness of experience, or at least fundamental to experience, there is awareness. You can't have experience without the faculty of awareness being present. So what I'm speaking about, this witnessing presence, is by and large already happening. It just requires a little bit more relaxation, which can lead to a dropping back. And then life that is seen from a quieter place, an uninvolved place. And this is something that can start happening anywhere, anytime. This can be happening while driving a car is happening. It may not be the ideal environment for this to happen in because of all of the pressure, let's say, all of the stimuli that are there when you're driving on a busy road. And once this faculty sets in, it doesn't require any effort. Whilst the identification is strong, a lot of input that requires our engagement with may actually prevent the effortless witnessing from setting in that moment. So it can help to walk through parks and gardens and just be aware of the trees and the birds, the sounds, and recognize that they're all arising in the present moment, and that you have nothing to do with what arises. be aware that the body is arising as part of the present moment experience, and you have nothing to do. You are not determining what arises. You are not determining the color of the hand, the shape of the hand, how the hand moves. All of that is happening as part of this dynamic, momentary experience. A relaxation really is very essential in order for this witnessing that I'm speaking about to kick in. You really have nothing to do. If there is still the sense, I have to do this witnessing, it's like going in for a massage and lying on the table and feeling like you must do something while being massaged. And that's not relaxation. It requires absolutely no thinking to witness whatever is happening as a happening, meaning to allow everything to be as it is, with no interest in changing it, with no interest in judging it. We might realize that that is the very opposite of our way of interacting with the experience that is there. That the standard way of interacting with the experience is to be interested in it in order to see if it aligns with what we think we need, to judge it as good or bad, to have an opinion, to argue with the other, to win, to get somewhere. And what I'm suggesting is the relaxation, the putting down of the weapons, which really is a specific strain of thinking, and open up to the notion that there is nowhere to go, there is nothing to do in that moment. And that the only place that we're going to find and connect to our essence is in the place where those weapons of the mind have been surrendered. And if that's not motivation enough, then it's not motivation enough. And that means that a stopping from time to time during the day isn't going to happen, because the system is saying it's more important for me to change and to get somewhere and to struggle than to relax and allow the essence of what I am to function in a way that has been suppressed for a whole lifetime. So that's why I started off saying that witnessing present has atrophied. It hasn't been allowed to function, because a different functioning of involvement has developed and has done a very good job of guiding how life is led. And so this is, in a way, an internal revolution, a stopping of that habit, even for, a few periods during a week. And that may start to reveal the value of something that the thinking mind simply can't imagine to be valuable. The thinking mind says, if I stop trying to get somewhere, if I stop judging life, if I stop having an opinion, then my objective and my goal is just going to take longer to reach. So to the thinking mind, this relaxation just doesn't make any sense. So I'm not talking to the thinking mind. I don't trust the thinking mind to appreciate what's being said. But luckily, the human being also has another aspect of the intellect, the working mind, and that's where the information is being directed to a part of us that maybe says, actually, I've lived life a particular way long enough, and it hasn't delivered the results that are satisfactory. I may be very successful, I've lived life and achieved this and this and this, and yet, if I'm honest, I can't say that those achievements have delivered an ongoing happiness in life. So the conceptual framework description says happiness isn't going to be found out there, but rather happiness will be found in the form of peace of mind with the circumstance of life that is not in your control, sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. It means peace of mind is to be found in your attitude to life, and the attitude of attachment to outcomes, the attitude of personal doership, is the attitude that keeps us involved. And that attitude and that involvement has atrophied this witnessing and knowing the core of oneself. And so the alternate attitude, the absence, so the alternate attitude is really the absence of the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, can't kick in unless simultaneously there is an appreciation that there is this dimension or this space that is outside of thinking.
Who's hearing the working mind?
Who is?
Hearing the working mind. You can register what's happening in the working mind also. So what is registering what's happening in the working mind?
When I missed that word in the first time you... Who is?
Hearing.
Hearing, okay. Well, the hearing is a faculty, it's one of the senses that the sense of hearing is then turned into information that the brain processes. And then the combination of the sounds and the intellect that processes the information in that sound, that is all a biological movement. And your question is, what is aware of the sound and what is aware of the conclusions of the working mind. And my answer would be, it is the witnessing presence that is aware of all of the biological functionings and the psychological functionings of suffering when they are there. It is always the witnessing presence that registers that. However, in the merged version, where the layers are merged, the hearing still happens. And it still happens because there is still presence, there is still awareness, but it's merged. And so there is no awareness from a distance. And when there's no awareness from a distance, there can't be any appreciation of the fact that there even is awareness. There is awareness because the sounds are always heard, so there has to be awareness. But there can't be an appreciation that the awareness is there. The appreciation that there is awareness is there is actually awareness becoming aware of itself. And that happens when the awareness and the sounds, the awareness and any of the senses separate. And then there is still awareness of the sounds, still the processing of the intellect. Awareness, aware of those as objects, which means more space in the system, you could say. And with that more space in the system, awareness can become aware of itself as that which is aware of everything that is happening.
Is it possible to become aware of awareness? I mean, I can't see myself, so how can awareness be aware of itself?
Only because it's a particular substance, you could say. It's not really a substance. But awareness can become aware of itself because it is awareness. If it wasn't awareness, then awareness couldn't really become aware of itself. Because it would need, you would say, it needs something to be outside of itself to be aware of. In the case of awareness, because it is awareness, it can break that rule. We've heard in the scriptures, how does it go? Awareness becoming aware of itself by itself, which really means it just happens. It's not your doing, so the intellect doesn't do it, the person doesn't do it, even though in an integrated sense, when we see it in an integrated fashion, awareness is an aspect of the person. But it doesn't require the thinking or the intellect aspect of the person to be involved in awareness becoming aware of itself by itself. The by itself really is saying it's a spontaneous happening. And that happening is it isn't even that, because that is what people are waiting for in terms of peak experiences, this peak experience of awareness becoming aware of itself. When the separation happens, it can happen very subtly and slowly. And what's more important is just that separation, which really means it feels as if a new platform is set up that is a platform further back than was the platform from which we knew ourselves previously. And the platform we knew ourselves previously was where awareness and the body and the thoughts and the emotions were all standing on the same platform. And essentially this separation is where a new platform is set up, and awareness takes a step back onto that new platform and sees life from a different perspective, sees the body, sees thoughts from a different perspective, which then the sense is, oh, I am not the thoughts, I am the one aware, the thing aware of the thoughts. Now, all of these things continue to evolve. So this separation can at first seem like, oh, what I am, the feeling is what I am, what I've always been is this formless awareness that is not the person. That's a very good sign in a way, but it's not very integrated. It's not really very accurate, although it feels very accurate based on how the experience shifts a little bit and how we tend to assess the experience. As our assessment starts to get guided by some more information, and after that change becomes more and more familiar and more established, we might start to realize, oh, actually this is an aspect of the person, and saying that I am not the body is maybe an over-exaggeration, but it's accurate based on how the shift feels. So one thing after another. But it's not important for the shift to be a radical shift that happens in a moment where everything is known completely differently. It can happen like that, and in fact, happening like that may cause additional issues. So just relax. This relaxing, you have nothing to do. Closing your eyes is another way. I mean, before we can have awareness in a witnessing presence of the ordinary daily living state, it can be maybe easier for there to be awareness in a closed eye meditation state, because there might be the capacity for more relaxation. Like you close your eyes and all of the stimuli are gone, and the inner world can be more readily available than if one's eyes are open. So if there is a closing of one's eyes, there is still experience. The experience is radically different in content to the experience with one's eyes open. There is still experience. So it is a matter of attention coming to the present moment, which really means attention becoming aware of what the closed eye experience is. What object is there in the closed eye experience that is most prevalent for attention to be aware of? Assuming that the sound you can, if you like, you can incorporate the sounds are part of the closed eye experience, and try to appreciate that the sounds, when they arise, are just sound objects arising within a field of awareness. They are not outside of your field of awareness. You know, the idea that the sounds are outside of the room is not really so accurate with being present with what the experience is. When we're present with the experience, maybe we'll appreciate the sounds arise within what I am, not outside of what I am. They arise within the field of awareness, within the witnessing presence. If they were outside of the witnessing presence, the sounds wouldn't be part of the experience. The very fact that they are part of the experience, the very fact that another person is part of the experience, means that object is arising within the witnessing presence and not outside of it. If it was outside of the witnessing presence, the person would not be part of the experience. Whenever there is the experience of the world, in any moment, the experience of a shopping center, of a kitchen, of a park, of streets, of cars, all of the objects, every single component of the experience arises within what I'm speaking about, not outside of it. The part of the universe that is outside of it is not part of the experience. This is an essential part of the witnessing happening, where there is a relaxation and an appreciation that everything is already within this witnessing presence. The walls, the people, the chairs, the space is all part of the experience arising within this witnessing presence. So with closed eyes, to bring attention to the present moment and to appreciate what objects are there, and I use the word object here loosely, is to bring, in my opinion, attention to this vast, empty blackness that you might start off calling the back of your eyelids, but really when you're present with the experience, where are the eyelids? Where that's just an interpretation based on a memory of how things are from the past. So to the extent that awareness becomes aware of this timeless, vast, boundless space, that can be the object, and I'm using the word object loosely, that there can be the witnessing of. And with closed eyes, it might become clear that the witnessing presence and this vast emptiness with no boundaries, with no up or down or edges, that vast emptiness and the witnessing presence are not necessarily two things. That the presence is all pervading. And in an instant, if you open your eyes, the whole of the visual image floods that very same awareness. That the witnessing present remains as the background which is aware of all of daily life experience. And when we fall into dream, it is that same witnessing presence that is aware of the content of dream. And from this perspective, in deep sleep, when the dream state falls away, you can look at deep sleep as the absence of the waking state and the dream state, and the witnessing presence remains as the background of all the three states. Now, being aware of the witnessing presence in sleep is not really so important. It's not an objective to reach that will deliver anything of any real significance. If it happens, it just means that the witnessing presence has become very unidentified with object and one-pointed and aware of itself. It means that witnessing presence always knows itself in the waking state, that there is an appreciation of the witnessing presence rather than it being completely identified and therefore lost, not available. It means that in the waking state there is that function is no longer atrophied. It is sharp. It is what allows pain to arise in the moment, even biological anger, unfortunate circumstance, and for there to be a groundedness in an aspect of the human being where there is a knowing that what I am is not touched by the circumstance, by the pleasure, by the pain, by the biological anger. If suffering is still arising when this witnessing presence has taken a step back, which it may well do because the suffering is part of the psychological entity, which is part of the intellect, and so until the roots of the suffering have been uprooted, there will be a time when the suffering continues to arise, but it will be witnessed. So no secondary involvement in the suffering. And that means a significant relief of the intensity of suffering. It doesn't mean the end of suffering, because the suffering is still arising, but there is the witnessing presence of it. And as that witnessing presence becomes more and more one-pointed, then there is the potential for that to be there in dream state, which really means the dream experience is constructed differently. The dream experience is then, just like the waking state experience is constructed differently, because the structure of the human being has changed. Then the dream state's constructed differently, and then in sleep, where there is no experience, there is the potential for the awareness to be aware of itself, but it isn't actually significant as far as what it is we're looking for in life, or what is satisfying in life, which is peace of mind in daily life. We actually have no suffering in sleep. So what is the benefit of anything changing in the sleep state? No practical benefit. This reference of awareness in the sleep state is there to highlight that this witnessing presence I'm speaking about is a background, is that which is witnessing everything that is happening. And primarily, we're looking for the peace of mind in daily living. So the important change is the change in the daily living state. And it isn't about, the important change isn't even about the witnessing presence. The important change is where the suffering comes to an end. And the witnessing presence can be a significant component in the suffering coming to an end. If the witnessing present was there and suffering continued to happen, what's the point? What's the point of truth, for example? Why do we want truth? Why do we want oneness? we should ask ourselves this question, because a lot of people are seeking for truth or for oneness. And so I say, why do you want truth? And it can seem like a silly question unless we ask honestly, or we look at it, because someone will say, what a stupid question, it's truth. I mean, why wouldn't you want truth? It's oneness, and all the problems in life come from separation. So I want oneness, because oneness is described as truth, or the absence of ignorance. So what a silly question, why do I want truth? And I say, well, actually, if you look at what you've said about oneness, you don't really want oneness, you want the end of problems in life. And the problem that is being spoken about, the problem of separation, is not the problems of your car breaking down and the problems of, businesses failing and ill health. So the end of separation doesn't fix those problems. The end of separation fixes the problem of uncomfortableness with oneself or suffering. So you only really want oneness because of what it delivers. You only want the end of separation because of what is said to come with the end of separation, which is the end of the uncomfortableness. Now often it's said that when the separation falls away, the person falls away. And so we go, that's great. That's what I want, the end of the person. Why do you want the end of the person? Because the person suffers so much. Really, you want the end of suffering. So truth. Why do you want truth? Well, I want truth because it's the truth. So if I said, okay, so let's say you can have the truth, you get given the truth, but then everything stays exactly the same. All your problems remain the same. So you still end up getting sick, you still end up losing your job, you still have all of those sort of problems, and suffering remains the same. But you have truth now. Like, to me, that truth is worth nothing. It hasn't delivered anything on a practical level. And so we need to ask the question, what am I really looking for? Am I looking for truth? What if you got the answers to how the universe works? Oh, okay, yeah, that's what I want. If the spiritual seeking, that's what you want. You want to understand the universe. And you got that, and your problems, your experience of life remains the same. What's it worth? So this is why in the conceptual framework, which is different to what we're talking about today, different part of the teaching, but they are very much linked. In the conceptual part of the teaching, Ramesh encouraged us. And when I took the advice, which only happened after I realized I wasn't doing this, and his encouragement was, keep your search practical. When I took that advice, a whole layer of investigation opened up, and a whole set of layers of suffering fell away that wouldn't have fallen away unless the search was kept practical. So what it means is, ask yourself this question in practical terms. As a seeker, what am I really looking for? And we might have all sorts of answers to that question. This teaching says, keep asking yourself that question until you come to the suggested answer in the teaching. And the suggested answer is, what we're looking for, whether we realize it or not, is a very simple happiness for the human being. We are looking for happiness in this life, whether we realize it or not. even if we are seeking truth, really what we're seeking is happiness. And the happiness that is available for the human being is happiness in the form of peace of mind, which really means, in practical terms, the end of the psychological thinking about what is happening in life that is inherently, at its core, an uncomfortableness with oneself. And enlightened masters have been telling us for thousands of years that it's available. They've been sharing with us teachings that are designed, as I mentioned at the beginning, to bring about these changes. And the sooner that we appreciate, actually, yes, I'm looking for something very practical. And it's not going to come to the one that wants it from the thinking mind. That entity, the thinking mind entity, which is often when teaching say the person dissolves, they're talking about the thinking mind. The thinking mind that wants this and thinks it can get this of its own volition, that entity doesn't get peace of mind. That entity falls away, and what is left is peace of mind for the remaining person. The remaining person means the person that was there before, but the person that was there before was the person with this particular component of the person, which is what is referred to in the conceptual framework as the thinking mind, that is obsessively seeking outcomes and looking at itself as the doer and looking at the other as the doer, and therefore feeling guilt and shame, blame and hatred, pride and arrogance, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. And all of those forms of thinking are the suffering. So we need to understand that intellectually. We need to be able to see this suffering, see the dynamics that are being described in the conceptual framework. But that on its own, in my experience, is not enough. We need to also focus on another side of another part of the seeking, which is to strengthen a connection with ourself, which is to be found outside of that thinking mind. But unless we understand conceptually and intellectually what that thinking mind is, the seeking will very often happen from the perspective of that thinking mind, which means the seeking is reinforcing the seeker and the suffering. So if in conjunction with the explanations we can then also strengthen shift as regularly as possible through practices that happen effortlessly when you're going for your morning walks, when you're sitting quietly looking at a sunset, when you're sitting in a coffee shop watching everyone move around, when you're at work and you decide to look up from your desk for just 30 seconds and allow everything to be as it is. And as that practice of connecting to the beingness and the witnessing awareness, as that starts to happen, then we find that remains there while you're working, and it doesn't need to be an intermittent practice. So the suggestion in today's talk about this is very important, to strengthen this connection with oneself, and that connection with oneself, or that aspect of oneself, starts to get brighter if we start allowing that functioning to be there more regularly through the day.
So is abiding by itself like a remembrance or a muscle we need to build?
Yeah, just for the sake of the recording, I can hear you, but
yeah, so just staying as a self, is it like a remembrance or like a muscle we need to build so we abide by it all the time?
yes. Once again, the words can be sometimes a bit hard to describe these things accurately. So they're described based on what it feels like, let's say. So it feels like we're building the self. But from another perspective, or the what I've been referring to today as the witnessing presence, as though we build it and it gets, the light starts off as a dim light and then it gets brighter and brighter and brighter. I wouldn't say the truth of the matter but I'll use that word relative. Probably from another perspective, I would prefer to say, no, that witnessing presence is shining brightly all the time for everyone. It's just that there is a veil that is keeping it dim. It's not, so it itself doesn't grow and get brighter or not brighter, but there is a veil, and the veil makes it seem dim or more bright to us, depending on how thick the veil is. And so what needs to be strengthened is a bypassing the veil, or a movement that drops the veil off, or parts of the veil off. And as that movement happens more and more frequently, essentially there is a familiarity, that muscle of removing the veil is stronger, and therefore the veil gets removed more regularly, more easily, and the brightness, in effect, there is more brightness. But actually the self that is felt as being bright is really, it's there, it's functioning through all of us already. But but your question really is there a muscle that needs to be strengthened? And I'd say yes. It's the muscle of moving there, of dropping out of thinking. And to drop out of thinking, there needs to be a real appreciation in the system that the thinking is completely off the mark. So today I was speaking and used the example that, blame, expectation, shame, these are the sorts of thinking, of the thinking mind, that includes in it our false sense of self. It's the involvement in life. And those forms of thinking are the suffering that happen fairly habitually and consistently. They've been kept in place because the system believes that they are beneficial. It hasn't really registered that they are not beneficial, and more importantly, based on really false information about how life works and what we really are. So to see that they're not beneficial just requires a bit of attention and feeling and connecting to the blame thoughts, and seeing how this is really disturbing my present moment experience, because it has this inherent uncomfortableness with the other in it, and that uncomfortableness with the other is actually an uncomfortableness with myself. Now, seeing that it disturbs the moment doesn't necessarily mean that we believe it to be untrue. So you can have someone blaming and seeing it disturbs their moment, but there is still in a way an investment in it, because it's believed to be based on truth, and the idea of it's still seen that someone did deliver pain to me, and that pain is an attack on who I am. And so it's seen that the blame is uncomfortable, but it hasn't been seen, let's say, that it's not true. So if we start seeing a set of thinking in our head that is doing, let's say, some maths calculations, right? The thinking is a series of maths calculations, and we see this, the thinking says 3 plus 3 equals 8, plus 10 divided by 3 equals, in brackets, 10 divided by 3 equals 15. right? And then equals and a certain answer. Now, for those that are following what I'm saying and have a mathematical mind, you'll know 3 plus 3 doesn't equal 8, which I think it was what it was. And whatever it was, 10 divided by 3 doesn't equal 15, right? So if we recognize that the thinking is really based on completely false logic, that all the thinking is completely wrong, your interest in that set of mathematical equations is going to be is very different than when you think you're listening to a TED talk that is full of really good information. So if you haven't noticed that set of equations that your mind is doing in terms of this math calculation are completely wrong, and you think that they're right, you have an interest in it. Once you've seen that thinking of those numbers is all rubbish, all of the calculations that the brain is doing are completely wrong. And you see it continuously. Everything, it hasn't got one single part of the equation right. Once you realize that guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation are like that mathematical thinking that hasn't got anything right, then there's a reason in the system for a dropping out of that thinking, like a really, let me relax from that thinking, because one, it feels uncomfortable, and two, you've seen it's all nonsense. Now, how do we see that the blame and the pride and the guilt is nonsense? That's probably for another day. The conceptual framework describes it. It says it's based on the belief in personal doership. What's the belief in personal doership? The belief in personal doership is a way of seeing oneself, the human being, as an entity that makes decisions, thinks a certain way, has a certain personality, all because of its doing, right? So that means that there is included in the structure of the person this false belief of an entity that is in control of the functioning of the human being. And someone might say, yeah, well, isn't that true? I'm the one that's speaking, I'm the one that thinks, and I'm the one making decisions, and I have complete control over what decision I make or not. The teaching says, well, when you look at it more closely, the human being is this complex entity that has been grown by life. The sperm and the egg came together, what I was talking about before, this complex growth process. We have no control over how our arms develop and what color eyes we have and skin and our brain and how it functions. We're not in control of all of the factors that are in our environment that also become part of the growing process. And in each moment, the human being is one way. So if you take a snapshot of this complex organism, if you had a camera that can take a snapshot of everything in that instant, the human being is one way in that instant. And that is a hugely complex machine that life has shaped up to that point of time so that it is that way. And in that moment, it will function according to the circumstance it finds itself one way. So the machine can't function differently. The output of the machine, meaning the decision that is made, the thought that arises when a bird is seen flying across is the culmination of the very complex situation that the entity finds itself in, and it sees something, smells something, tastes something, hears something, touches something. And then a series of reactions happen which create feelings, create thoughts, create actions, create decisions. So when you're faced with a decision and all of the processing and analyzing of the different options and what choices you can make, and all of that is the impersonal functioning of a hugely complex machine designed by life to function exactly the way it's functioning. And included in that machine is the erroneous interpretation of what happens through the machine as being the doing of this erroneous belief of personal doership. So when that's seen to be the basis of guilt towards the other for what they did that delivers pain, and included in it is you should have and you could have been different, which is the error. They are a very complex instrument, and they functioned exactly the way they were designed to function, given everything that came before, given the circumstance they found themselves in. So yes, the new attitude, with an appreciation of what they are, is pain was delivered. It was delivered through that human being and the functioning of that human being, and that was my destiny for that pain to be delivered, and their destiny to be the instrument, and my destiny for them to be the instrument through which the pain was delivered. So, pain received. The blame story is a story that doesn't appreciate what I just described, but instead sees some imaginary version of life that should have been different and could have been different, which is a complete fiction. Now, until our system recognizes all of the forms of suffering to be based on a complete fiction of who we are and what we need in order to be complete, and a complete fiction about how life functions, then there's going to be an interest and an involvement and this identification with the suffering. Once the system understands what I've just described, a dropping out of thinking simply because of the thought that might arise that says, or the thought I used yesterday was the thought I am. And the thought I am is the remembrance after awareness has landed on the fact that this nonsense thinking is happening. The thought I am arises, which is just a remembrance. I am outside of that thinking. I exist, and I'm complete. So that's, one of the exercises of dropping into our being, which really means dropping out of the thinking and finding a different platform to rest on. And that platform is either the sense of being or the witnessing presence that is aware of the thoughts as objects, aware of the experience of life from a perspective that we can actually rest in for an indefinite amount of time. It's not a place that we can only stay for short periods of time. At first, it is because we get dragged out of it. But in the end, we find this is my home. This is coming back home, is finding a connection to the part of the human being that is what we can say more real because it's less changing. And besides the less changing, who cares about that? The fact is that that part of me is always there, and it's at peace with life, with itself. So in practical terms, we're looking for the end of suffering, and the end of suffering is a combination of the thinking stopping. The thinking stops when there is the capacity to witness the thinking, so that it can be analyzed and seen for what it is. That witnessing allows us to know that that thinking is not what I am exclusively. So a combination of all these things is what's part and parcel of the process that leads to a very practical change in the makeup and the experience that the human being has of daily life. A change that in the end, after all of these things, we can say is being human, living life until the body dies, doing whatever we're destined to do, having to engage in daily life circumstance, pleasure sometimes, pain at other times, and yet we find ourselves connected to a part of myself that is already complete and at peace, and therefore there is this permeation of peace of mind into the rest of the layers of life. Yes.
Namaste, sir.
Hello.
So can you please talk a little bit about too much triggering of too much feeling of lack and abandonment in daily life?
Mm-hmm. So if we find ourselves with that structure of involvement and with the structure of doership and attachment to outcome, which leads to the involvement, there's going to be a lot of suffering. And suffering effectively means no space in the system. The more suffering there is, the more involvement there is, and the less sense of space there is. And when there's no space, we don't know which way is up and which way is down. If some space has come in, because some things have changed, and the suffering gets triggered, well then that's a bit of a godsend, because the suffering is triggered, but now it's being witnessed from a detached point of view. So there is some space, there can be some benefit in the suffering arising because it can be understood. When there's no space and the suffering is being triggered, it can be very beneficial to extract yourself from situations where you are triggered and the suffering then becomes intense. So I think it's fair to say that monks go and live in monasteries at first to deal with this particular issue. That in ordinary daily life, the amount of stimuli and pleasure and pain from people, your family, your friends, work colleagues, even strangers, is too much. The system is always being triggered. There's no space and there's no hope for the distance, but yet no hope for the process to progress. And so if someone extracts themselves from that environment, it's not the solution, because the roots of suffering haven't been dealt with by extracting yourself from the situation. However, you've extracted yourself from troublesome situation, and that means that the roots get triggered less, and so then there is more space. And so as long as your motivation and your intention is to ultimately look at the roots, an interim measure of extracting yourself from triggersome circumstance can be beneficial, because then you find yourself with more quietness and more capacity for the investigation to happen. And as I've said in previous days, the investigation really needs to happen not only when we are faced with a lot of suffering. So if someone is a fair weather seeker, meaning they're only interested in seeking when things are beneficial for the seeking, or when it serves them, then that doesn't really help, because they get triggered, there's a lot of suffering, and then they pick up the books and there's no space. If someone finds themselves seeking when there is space, then the muscles that need to be strengthened are being strengthened. And then when the trigger happens, then we find more space. So I hope that answered your question.
Yes, this what you said, that is also beneficial. But sir, a little bit more something else I feel like hearing about this too much sense of lack and abandonment.
Mhm.
I don't know what I feel like hearing, but something else
Okay.
I feel like hearing. I mean, what is this? What is this feeling?
So that is linked, it fits those feelings of abandonment and lack really means probably it's a lack of self-worth or a lack of being good enough, and not feeling good enough and abandonment are very linked because we feel abandoned because there's a sense that I have been abandoned because I'm not good enough. So those two senses or feelings of suffering are very linked. Sense of abandonment and not being worthy, not being good enough, and they fit under the category of guilt. So on the surface, guilt is, I left my friend when he needed me. I didn't go around and help him move house and move his furniture, let's say, because I didn't feel like it. And then afterwards we feel guilty for not having helped. And the guilt and the shame is, I wasn't a good enough friend. I didn't live up to the standards and I should have been different. So that's guilt in its fairly superficial level, or guilt as it would apply in a fairly a daily living experience. That sense of not being good enough can and does stem from a much deeper and much more profound and much more metaphysical, you could say, sense of not being good enough. If we took it down to the deepest that I've seen, and that means because I've seen it doesn't mean it's actually like this. It's just an experience that at some point came up and revealed to me that the sense of shame might even be linked to the process, whatever it is, of coming into incarnate form. And coming into incarnate form, I'll talk about a step above that first, so then it becomes, this root that I'm talking about becomes even more understandable. When you are a baby in the womb of the mother, you might feel very safe and protected, content in your world. And then suddenly at about 9 months, a whole lot of strange stuff starts happening. And you're getting shoved and pushed and grabbed and squeezed and thrown out. And let's say that as part of the human psyche and development, that process is interpreted not on the intellect level, because the baby doesn't have a developed intellect, but let's say some sort of more primordial intellect that isn't based on language, but more primordial than that. The baby might think, I'm being ejected, I'm being abandoned, or ejected and thrown out. The baby might actually feel, what have I done wrong to deserve this? And that might be the conclusion that gets put in place in the human psyche in the process of birth. Now, from outside, we can see that's a complete misinterpretation of that process. They haven't done anything wrong and they're not being thrown out. It's a natural part of life. I had a vision or a memory or something that came up at one point. Now, this doesn't mean this doesn't mean it's true, but at the time, when I was linking it into the series of because there's usually a mirroring of events that get interpreted the same way in someone's life. events of abandonment, if someone has a strong sense of abandonment, will tend to keep happening, and they will keep reinforcing that abandonment. And so this mirroring of events and repetition of events tends to be a dynamic of how life plays out. So what if we go back a step before even birth, physical birth, and maybe coming into conception could be experienced by spirit, let's say, as a being thrown out of God, being thrown out of the unmanifest. Now I'm just putting this forward as a story, let's say. I had some energy at some point when a lot of energies were being released that played itself out with a vision of the birth process, and then of a revelation of maybe this being something even more metaphysical at the point of conception, where the unmanifest becomes the manifest for this particular incarnation. And so it's like, what have I done to be thrown out of God, to be thrown out of the manifest, the unmanifest into the manifest, thrown out of the ultimate non-duality into the duality? And then that era, because let's say that was just part of the manifesting process, and it had nothing to do with being a bad boy and being thrown out of the unmanifest. Just like being born had nothing to do with being, you're not good enough, you're a bad boy, and being. But what if that's what gets registered deep in the psyche? It's an error, right? It's an error about oneself that might get locked away. I'm not good enough, I was thrown out. And that might become part of the self-identity. And then, because of this mirroring effect, we might have other events where, an example would be a child that is adopted out. That event of being adopted out could, it's highly understandable how it can be interpreted as, I was adopted out because I'm not good enough. So that's the third version of this error being solidified. And then when that person who grows up and a girlfriend goes off with someone else and just leaves, they might have this sense of abandonment again, which may have nothing to do, in all of these cases, may have nothing to do with the worth of the person. And yet that becomes the ingrained self-image. So this self-image needs to start dissolving, and it starts dissolving with an investigation and a feeling into these feelings, and hopefully an interpretation of the feelings that were locked away based on past events. So the deep suffering of the abandonment that was locked away in the system, if it comes up and it can be felt, and you experience it and you express it fully, hopefully, if you're going through this seeking process, there will have been a change in your makeup that, at least on some level, that experience can be reassessed, not from the I'm not good enough point of view, but actually seen as a happening, as part of the story of life, and that there is no doer that could be responsible for, like personally responsible for being the way they are. And that aside, you might actually be able to see that the event that happened that was interpreted as being about me was completely not about you. That adoption wasn't about you, but about a financial circumstance or a threat from family, or had nothing to do with you. So all of these things can't be explained just in words. The words can help bring light onto these very complex dynamics that and the light might be something that allows it to be processed and seen.
Yes, thank you, sir.